The heavy glass door of the coastal Rhode Island bank branch sealed shut behind me, cutting off the damp morning wind. But the chill remained in my chest. I sat across from Isabel, a commercial lending manager who had known me for 4 years, watching the blue light of her monitor reflect in her glasses. It was 10 in the morning on a Monday. My cousin's wedding, a 300-guest spectacle at a Newport historic mansion, had ended barely 36 hours ago. My tuxedo was still in the trunk of my car, smelling faintly of the chafing fuel and industrial dish soap from the catering tent where I had been assigned to sit. I had come to the bank because the final vendor draws on the event financing line I had co-signed were being rejected for insufficient funds. I assumed it was a banking error. I had authorized a $75,000 credit facility specifically structured for event vendor escrows. I sat with my hands folded on Isabel's desk, apologizing for the inconvenience, explaining that the caterers and the florists were probably just hitting the account all at once. Isabel stopped typing. She did not look at the stack of invoices I had brought. She looked at me, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to a quiet, uncomfortable pity. She turned her monitor slightly toward me and pointed to a ledger screen I barely understood. Then she explained exactly where the $75,000 had gone, a revelation that dismantled my family, my financial security, and my understanding of the last 15 years of my life in a matter of seconds. To understand how I ended up sitting at a plastic folding table with the waitstaff at a wedding I had entirely financed, you have to understand the debt I thought I owed Elaine Garrison. Elaine was my mother's older sister, and she was an institution in Newport. For 2 decades, Garrison Events had orchestrated the most exclusive coastal weddings in the state. She was a woman of aggressive elegance, the kind of person who could command a room of panicked brides and temperamental chefs with a whisper. When I was 16, my parents' marriage dissolved in a catastrophic bankruptcy that ended with my father leaving the country and my mother entering a severe, prolonged depression. It was Elaine who drove to our foreclosed house, packed my bags and moved me into her guest room. She paid for the rest of my high school education. She gave me a job loading chairs and setting up tents for her company. She constantly reminded me, never with malice but always with a heavy, performative sigh, that family takes care of family, even when it is a burden. I absorbed that lesson completely. I spent my 20s building a quiet, hyper-organized life. I became a logistics director for a maritime shipping firm, managing supply chains and port schedules. I bought a small house. I saved my money. I became the reliable, boring nephew who always answered the phone. Elaine's business, meanwhile, had begun to struggle. The event industry had shifted. Younger planners with sharper social media presences were taking her market share, and her overhead was massive. When her own daughter Chloe got engaged, Elaine saw it as her ultimate portfolio piece. This was going to be the wedding that put Garrison Events back on the map. There was only one problem. Elaine had over-leveraged her business lines of credit to keep her office open. 2 months before the wedding, she came to my house, sat at my kitchen table and wept. She said the vendors were demanding full payment up front because of her recent credit dip. She said she would be ruined, and Chloe would be humiliated. She did not ask me to give her money. She asked me to use my pristine credit to open a specialized event financing account, a short-term facility that releases funds directly to vendors via escrow. She promised she had the receivables coming in from her summer clients to pay it off entirely within 90 days. She just needed my name to bridge the gap. I thought about the guest room when I was 16. I thought about family taking care of family. I signed the paperwork. The arrangement was supposed to be simple. I would approve the vendor invoices, the bank would release the funds directly to the caterer, the venue, and the florists, and Elaine would handle the design and execution. For 6 weeks I received digital prompts on my phone for vendor payments, a catering deposit, a lighting and staging fee, a floral acquisition charge. I clicked approve on all of them, watching the balance climb. Elaine assured me everything was proceeding perfectly. The first sign that something was structurally wrong occurred when I arrived at the venue on Saturday evening. It was a sprawling, Gilded Age estate overlooking the water. I walked in wearing a tailored suit, expecting to find my table card near the front. I scanned the elegant calligraphy on the seating chart stationed in the foyer. My name was not among the family tables. It was not among the extended relatives. It was not on the board at all. Before I could ask the maître d', Elaine appeared. She was wearing a silver gown, holding a clipboard, moving with frantic energy. She grabbed my arm, thanked me briefly for coming, and handed me a laminated vendor badge. She said they were at maximum capacity in the ballroom due to fire code regulations, and since I knew the logistics of event management, she desperately needed me to act as the venue liaison for the evening. She physically guided me away from the grand doors, down a service hallway, and into the massive catering staging area behind the main tent. She pointed to a metal folding table pushed against a stack of spare chairs, right next to the dish scraping station. That was my seat. I was told to stay there, manage any complaints from the staff, and keep the service doors clear. She kissed my cheek and disappeared into the ballroom, leaving me standing in the overwhelming smell of roasting meat and burning, chafing fuel. For the first 2 hours, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself Elaine was just being her usual, hyper-controlling self. She needed someone back here, and I was the only family member she trusted with logistics. I sat on a hard metal chair, listening to the muffled sounds of the string quartet and the clinking of crystal from the other side of the heavy velvet curtains. Whenever I tried to step out to see Chloe or say hello to my cousins, Elaine or one of her assistants would intercept me, handing me a task. Check the ice delivery, count the surplus wine bottles, direct the valet shift change. I was being actively contained. At 9 o'clock, the catering captain, a woman named Gloria, whom I recognized from my teenage years working for Elaine, sat down across from me with a plate of leftover rolls. She looked exhausted. She asked me why I was sitting back here instead of in the dining room. I gave her the fire code excuse Elaine had given me. Gloria laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. She said the ballroom was 20 people under capacity. Then she leaned in and asked when Elaine was planning to clear the remaining catering balance. I frowned. I told Gloria I had authorized the final catering draw through the event escrow account 3 weeks ago. The account had released $22,000 for food and beverage. Gloria stopped chewing. She pulled her phone from her apron, opened a PDF and handed it to me. It was the catering contract Elaine had signed with her company. The total for the food was not $22,000. It was barely $9,000. Gloria explained they had been forced to downgrade the menu to basic chicken and bulk pasta because Elaine claimed the budget had been slashed. I stared at Gloria's phone. I pulled up my own banking app and looked at the invoice Elaine had sent me to approve 3 weeks prior. It had the same catering company logo, but it detailed a prime rib and local seafood menu, totaling $22,000. The invoice I had paid was a forgery. I did not confront Elaine that night. My logistics background kicked in, overriding my anger with a cold, methodical need for data. I spent the rest of the reception quietly gathering information. I talked to the lighting crew. I talked to the floral assistants packing up the ceremony arch. I asked them casual questions about their invoices and payment schedules. By midnight, when I was finally allowed to leave the service tent, I had confirmed that every single vendor at the wedding was operating on a deeply discounted, heavily compromised budget, and most of them were still waiting for their final checks. Yet, my $75,000 credit line was completely maxed out, which brought me to Isabel's desk on Monday morning. After I explained the discrepancies, Isabel pulled up the routing data for the escrow disbursements. The event financing line I had opened was designed to pay vendors directly, preventing the borrower from using the funds for personal expenses. But Isabel showed me that the routing numbers on the invoices I had been approving did not belong to the catering company, the florists, or the venue. They all belonged to a single commercial operating account. Garrison Events LLC. Elaine had not used my credit to pay for her daughter's wedding. She had fabricated inflated vendor invoices, routed my approved escrow funds directly into her own failing business account to cover her commercial rent and payroll debts, and then hired the cheapest possible vendors for the actual wedding, promising to pay them out of pocket later. She seated me with the staff not because of a fire code, but because if I had sat in the ballroom, I would have seen the cheap food and the sparse flowers. I would have talked to the vendors. I would have realized the luxury wedding I paid for did not exist. I was placed behind a curtain so she could liquidate my credit in peace. Isabel looked at me, her hands resting on her keyboard. She explained that because the funds were transferred across state lines through a federally insured institution based on fraudulent invoices, this was no longer a family dispute over a wedding. It was commercial wire fraud. Isabel told me I had a choice. I could assume the $75,000 debt personally, or she could flag the disbursements as fraudulent, which would immediately freeze Garrison Events' banking profile and trigger an investigation by the bank's fraud division. I sat in the quiet office, listening to the hum of the air conditioning. I thought about the metal folding chair. I thought about the years of being told I was a burden, a debt that needed to be repaid through endless compliance. I realized Elaine had never seen me as a nephew. She saw me as an asset to be managed, a contingency plan she could exploit when her own poor decisions caught up with her. I told Isabel to freeze the accounts. I signed the fraud dispute forms. I provided copies of the forged invoices Elaine had sent me, alongside the real vendor contracts Gloria had forwarded to me that morning. I walked out of the bank feeling physically lighter, the damp coastal air suddenly sharp and clear in my lungs. I did not go to my office. I drove straight to Elaine's commercial studio in downtown Newport. The storefront was an exercise in curated perfection, filled with linen swatches and floral arrangements. I walked in and found Elaine standing behind her massive marble reception desk, yelling into her cell phone. When she saw me, she hung up, her face pale. The bank freeze had already hit. Her payroll was blocked. Her operating cards were declining. She immediately went into her usual routine, a blend of maternal guilt and aggressive victimhood. She demanded to know what I had done. She said the bank was making a mistake, that I needed to call them and release the funds immediately or she would lose her office by Friday. She reminded me of the guest room. She reminded me of the private school tuition. She told me I owed her this, that her family absorbs the impact for each other. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an apology. I pulled the stack of papers from my briefcase and laid them out on the marble desk, side by side. The forged catering invoice, the real catering contract, the routing number traced from the bank. I watched her eyes dart across the documents, the frantic energy drained out of her, replaced by a rigid, terrified silence. I explained exactly what was going to happen. I told her the bank's fraud division was currently reviewing the wire transfers. I told her that I had spoken with Gloria and the other vendors, and they were preparing to file liens against her business for the unpaid balances from Saturday. I explained that she had two options. She could face the bank's federal fraud charges and explain to her daughter why her wedding resulted in a prison sentence. Or she could sign over the deed to her commercial office space, transferring the equity to a trust I would establish to pay off the $75,000 credit line and settle the remaining vendor debts. She stared at me, her mouth open, trying to find the angle, trying to find the frightened 16-year-old boy she had conditioned to obey. But he was not there. The logistics director was there, and he was simply managing a liability. She started to cry, real tears this time, burying her face in her hands, saying her business was all she had, that without the office, she was nothing. She begged me to just take a payment plan to let her work it off. I told her she had 48 hours to contact her attorney and draft the transfer of assets, or I would let the bank forward the file to the authorities. I turned around and walked out of the studio without waiting for her answer. The fallout was predictable and deeply exhausting. Elaine tried to rally the family against me, claiming I was ruthlessly destroying her legacy over a misunderstanding. A few relatives called me, demanding I show her mercy, repeating the same tired lines about family loyalty. I did not argue with them. I simply mailed them copies of the forged invoices and blocked their numbers. Chloe stopped speaking to me, unable to accept that her perfect wedding was a crime scene. By the end of the month, Elaine had surrendered the equity in her business. The studio was sold. I used the proceeds to clear the fraudulent credit line and personally handed cashier's checks to Gloria and the other vendors who had been cheated. Garrison Events ceased to exist. Elaine moved out of Newport, retreating to a small apartment in a neighboring state, quietly managing a local bridal shop. I lost most of my extended family in the process. The Thanksgiving dinners and summer barbecues were gone, replaced by a permanent heavy silence. But it was a silence I welcomed. I spent a Saturday afternoon in my backyard, cleaning out my home office. I found the laminated vendor badge Elaine had pinned to my lapel on the night of the wedding. I held it for a moment, feeling the cheap plastic edges. Then I dropped it into the shredder, listening to the mechanical grind, watching the pieces fall into the bin. I made a cup of coffee, sat on my porch, and watched the evening settle over the neighborhood, finally free of a debt I never actually owed. The heavy glass doors of the hotel ballroom swung open, and the hum of 200 industry professionals networking over overpriced coffee hit me like a physical wave. I adjusted the grip on my leather briefcase. For the past 2 weeks, since I built the financial timeline of Elaine's localized Ponzi scheme on my dining room wall, I had maintained total radio silence. I ignored the hostile texts from extended family. I ignored Chloe's escalating social media posts. I instructed Harrison, my attorney, to file for a routine extension on the lawsuit, giving Elaine's legal team the false impression that I was scrambling, overwhelmed, and preparing to negotiate a surrender. I scanned the room and easily spotted her. Elaine was holding court near the stage, surrounded by younger event planners and a few local journalists. She wore a tailored ivory suit, looking every bit the resilient matriarch weathering an unjust storm. She was actively performing the role of the martyred business owner. I watched her wipe a non-existent tear from her eye as she spoke to a reporter from a regional lifestyle magazine. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was laying the public relations groundwork to launch a new agency, framing her recent bankruptcy as the result of a hostile, predatory family member rather than her own criminal mismanagement. I did not approach her immediately. I walked to the back of the room, taking a seat in the last row of the seating area, arranged for the upcoming panel. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the 12 bound dossiers. Each one contained the undeniable architecture of her fraud, the forged catering invoices, the loan origination files I had secured from Isabel, the time-shifted payment logs proving she used future deposits to pay past debts, and sworn affidavits from Gloria and 3 other vendors who had finally agreed to go on the record. It was a bulletproof, mathematically precise dismantling of Garrison Events LLC. The panel began 10 minutes later. The moderator, a local real estate developer, introduced Elaine with a sympathetic tone, praising her for her transparency and grace under recent, unexpected pressures. The audience offered a warm round of applause. Elaine smiled gracefully, adjusted her microphone, and began her opening remarks. She spoke about the importance of legacy, the tragic reality of family betrayal, and how she was using this temporary setback to restructure her vision for the future of Newport weddings. I waited until she finished her opening monologue, right as the moderator opened the floor for the first round of industry questions. I stood up. The room was large, but my voice, trained by years of directing chaotic shipping docks, carried clearly over the murmurs. "Elaine," I said, projecting my voice so the microphone picked it up, "since this panel is about crisis management and financial transparency in event planning, I was wondering if you could walk the audience through the specific accounting mechanism you used to fund your daughter's wedding last month." The room went completely silent. Heads turned. Elaine's smile froze, the color draining from her face as she recognized me standing at the back of the room. The moderator, confused by the sudden tension, leaned into his microphone. "I'm sorry, sir. Questions from the floor need to be related to the general industry." "It is an industry question," I interrupted smoothly, walking slowly down the center aisle. "Elaine is currently soliciting new clients and investors in this room. I think it's crucial for them to understand her proprietary method for managing escrow accounts." I stopped at the front row, directly below the elevated stage. I looked up at her. She gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles turning white. "For instance," I continued, holding up one of the thick dossiers, "could you explain to the florists and caterers in the room how you managed to submit a $22,000 catering invoice to a federally insured bank for escrow disbursement, but the actual contract you signed with the caterer was only for $9,000. A low murmur rippled through the audience. I saw several local vendors, people who had worked with Elaine for years, sit up straighter, their expressions shifting from sympathy to sudden, sharp suspicion. "This is completely inappropriate," Elaine hissed into the microphone, her voice trembling. She looked frantically at the hotel security guard standing near the exit. "He is a disgruntled relative involved in active litigation. He needs to be removed." "I am involved in litigation," I agreed loudly, turning slightly to address the room. "Elaine is suing me, claiming I am a shadow partner in her firm and therefore responsible for her debts, which is why I felt compelled to conduct a full audit of my supposed company." I walked over to the press table where the local journalists were sitting, stunned, with their recorders running. I placed a bound dossier in front of the reporter Elaine had been crying to earlier. "Inside this file," I announced to the room, "is the documented proof that Garrison Events has not been a functioning business for over 3 years. It is a localized Ponzi scheme. The documents show that Elaine Garrison routinely took 50% cash deposits from new brides and immediately used those funds to pay off the vendors from previous weddings, pocketing the difference. When the new bookings dried up, she used my personal credit line through forged vendor invoices to cover her commercial rent and payroll, leaving the vendors for her own daughter's wedding entirely unpaid." The silence in the ballroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the sound of a 20-year reputation instantly evaporating. I walked along the front row, handing the remaining dossiers to the most prominent vendors and industry leaders in the audience. I made sure to hand one directly to the regional director of the Chamber of Commerce. Elaine stepped back from the podium. She didn't try to defend herself. She didn't yell. The carefully constructed facade crumbled in real time. She looked at the dossiers in the hands of her peers, people who now realized their own unpaid invoices were not the result of a temporary cash flow issue, but the final gasp of a calculated fraud. She looked small, desperate, and entirely exposed. "You promised," she whispered, stepping away from the microphone, her voice barely audible. "You promised you just wanted the studio." "I did," I replied calmly, standing at the base of the stage. "And I was willing to walk away. But then you sent a process server to my house. You tried to burn my life down to keep yourself warm. Now, everyone gets to see the fire." I turned my back on the stage and walked up the center aisle. The security guard didn't move to stop me. The attendees parted, watching me with a mixture of shock and quiet validation as they began flipping through the bank records and affidavits I had provided. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked out into the hotel lobby. The immediate consequences were catastrophic for Elaine. By the time I reached my car, the journalist had already tweeted a summary of the dossiers. Within 3 hours, the law firm Elaine had hired to sue me officially dropped her as a client, realizing they had been retained using stolen funds and that her entire case was built on a fraudulent premise. By the end of the week, the regional authorities, spurred by the sudden influx of complaints from the vendors who had read my timeline, formally opened a criminal investigation into Garrison Events LLC. Chloe's social media campaign collapsed overnight. The same followers who had offered her sympathy suddenly turned on her, demanding to know if she was complicit in her mother's theft of other brides' deposits. She deleted all her accounts and moved to Boston with her new husband, cutting all ties with her mother in a desperate attempt to distance herself from the legal fallout. The lawsuit against me was dismissed with prejudice. I never had to step foot in a courtroom. The timeline I had built, combined with the public exposure, neutralized the threat entirely. Months later, I received a small, unprompted package in the mail. It was from Gloria. Inside was a jar of incredibly expensive artisanal sea salt and a handwritten note thanking me. She mentioned that with Elaine permanently removed from the local market, the independent vendors had formed a cooperative network, ensuring fair contracts and transparent escrow practices. The industry was healing. I placed the jar on my kitchen counter. I looked out the window at the quiet street, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The house felt incredibly still, but it was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of impending conflict. It was the clean, clear quiet of absolute autonomy. I opened my laptop, reviewed a shipping manifest for a cargo vessel currently navigating the Atlantic, and went back to work, finally free to build a life that belonged entirely to me. 14 months after the hotel ballroom incident, I found myself sitting on a polished wooden bench in the corridor of the federal courthouse in Providence. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4 were closed, muffling the proceedings inside. The air smelled of floor wax and old paper. The federal wire fraud investigation had moved with a slow, grinding inevitability. Once the FBI's Financial Crimes Division subpoenaed the bank records from Isabel's branch and matched them against the fabricated vendor invoices I had provided, Elaine's legal options evaporated. She had eventually pleaded guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud to avoid a lengthy public trial, and today was her sentencing hearing. I was not required to be there. The prosecution had already secured their conviction, but I needed to see the final ledger balanced. As I waited for the recess to end, a man in a rumpled grey suit approached me. He introduced himself as Vance, Elaine's federal public defender. Her private attorneys had abandoned her months ago when her assets were frozen. Vance looked exhausted, carrying a thick manila folder bursting with character reference letters he had desperately tried to scrape together. He sat on the bench next to me, leaving a careful distance between us. He explained that the sentencing guidelines for this tier of wire fraud recommended 36 to 48 months. He said Elaine was terrified. He then asked, in a low, practiced voice, if I would be willing to address the judge and request leniency on the basis of our family history. He suggested I mention the years I lived in her house when I was a teenager. He framed it as a gesture of closure, a way to show the court that despite the financial damage, the family was choosing healing over punishment. I looked at Vance. I did not feel anger toward him. He was simply doing his job, managing the logistics of a failing defense. I told him that I had already submitted my victim impact statement in writing, and it contained nothing but the exact financial timeline of her fraud. I explained that Elaine did not take me in when I was 16 out of charity. She took me in because it gave her a reliable, unpaid laborer for her event setups and a permanent psychological leverage she could cash in whenever she made a mistake. I told Vance that if I spoke to the judge today, I would only reiterate that she used her own daughter's wedding as a cover to steal from local small businesses and her own nephew. Vance stopped nodding. He quietly closed his folder, thanked me for my time, and walked back into the courtroom. When the doors opened for the public, I took a seat in the second row. Elaine was sitting at the defense table. She looked remarkably small. The aggressive elegance that had defined her entire public persona was gone. She wore a plain dark blouse. Her hair was pulled back tightly. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up and gripped the podium. She cried, apologizing to the court, but even then she could not entirely abandon her narrative. She told the judge that she had simply become overwhelmed by the pressure to maintain a legacy, that the expectations of the Newport social scene had clouded her judgment. She framed the forged invoices as a desperate, temporary mistake made by a mother trying to protect her family's reputation. The judge, a severe woman with sharp, observing eyes, looked down at her papers. She interrupted Elaine's tears. The judge stated that this was not a case of a disorganized business owner falling behind on bills. She read aloud from the logistical timeline I had built. She noted the calculated precision required to intercept escrow disbursements, the premeditation of forging vendor letterheads, and the sheer cruelty of sitting the man who financed the event behind a curtain so he wouldn't witness the theft. The judge made it clear that Elaine was not a victim of social pressure. She was a predator who had cannibalized her own family and community to maintain an illusion. The sentence was 41 months in a federal minimum security facility, followed by 3 years of supervised release and court-ordered restitution to the remaining vendors she had defrauded. Elaine slumped into her chair. As the bailiff approached to take her into custody, she finally turned and looked at me. There was no defiance left in her eyes, just a hollow, panicked realization that the bill had finally come due and there was no one left to co-sign for her. I held her gaze for a brief moment, feeling no triumph, only the cold, quiet satisfaction of a closed file. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom before they put the cuffs on her. As I walked down the courthouse steps into the bright, crisp afternoon air, I saw a familiar figure standing near the street corner. It was Chloe. I had not seen her since the night of the wedding. She was wearing a simple coat, holding a coffee cup, looking up at the stone facade of the building. She had not gone inside to witness the sentencing. When she saw me, she froze. For a moment, the heavy, complicated history of our family hung in the air between us. I stopped at the bottom of the steps. I didn't know if she was going to scream at me or turn away. Instead, she just gave a slow, barely perceptible nod, an acknowledgement of the reality we both now had to live with. I nodded back. I didn't cross the street to speak to her. Some distances are healthy, and some boundaries should never be dismantled once they are built. She turned and walked toward the train station, and I walked toward my car. My life changed dramatically in the year following the trial, though not in ways that were externally obvious. I kept my job as a logistics director for the maritime shipping firm. I still managed supply chains and port schedules, but I no longer spent my weekends answering frantic calls from relatives demanding favors. I no longer attended holidays where my presence was treated as a charitable allowance. I had surgically removed the infection of obligation from my life. Instead, I found a different kind of community. After the local vendors formed their cooperative network in the wake of Elaine's bankruptcy, Gloria had reached out to me. The vendors knew how to cook, arrange flowers, and design lighting, but they lacked a central logistical framework to protect their contracts. I started consulting for them on a freelance basis. I helped them design airtight escrow agreements, standardized invoice routing, and vendor protection clauses that made it impossible for another event planner to exploit them. I used the exact skills I had developed to survive Elaine, to protect the people she had tried to ruin. On a Friday evening in late October, Gloria invited me to a small dinner. She had finally saved enough money to open a permanent brick-and-mortar tasting room for her catering company, independent of any event planner's control. I arrived at the address, a beautifully restored brick building near the harbor. The space was warm, filled with the smell of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. There were about 20 people there, mostly the independent vendors from the cooperative celebrating the launch. Gloria saw me walk in. She smiled, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked over. She didn't hand me a laminated badge. She didn't point me toward the service hallway. She put her hand on my shoulder, guided me to the center of the room, and pulled out a chair at the main table. It was set with real crystal, heavy silver flatware, and a linen napkin. I sat down among people who did not see me as a debt, an asset, or a backup plan. I unfolded the napkin, listened to the laughter around the table, and watched the harbor lights reflect in the window, completely at peace in the seat I had actually earned.
In the case study presented by the infographic, a profound exploration of family betrayal unfolds, dissecting the intricate layers of coercive control and financial fraud within a specific narrative context. The journey begins with the psychological manipulation that laid the foundation for the scheme. Here, we witness the strategic cultivation of debt and a sense of obligation. A young man, having experienced the upheaval of his parents' bankruptcy and his father's subsequent departure from the country, found himself vulnerable and in need of support. Into this void stepped his aunt, Elaine Garrison, a prominent figure in the Newport event planning industry. Elaine provided not altruistic assistance, but a calculated form of aid, taking him in and paying for his remaining high school education. However, this support was not unconditional, rather, it was framed as a burden family must bear, creating an invisible, yet crushing, weight of indebtedness in the boy. This isolation and indebtedness became powerful tools. By exploiting his vulnerability, Elaine fostered compliance and dependency, ensuring he would feel perpetually indebted to her. This dynamic was further sustained by Elaine's carefully constructed identity. Outwardly, she was a figure of institution and eloquence, an institution in Newport, capable of commanding any room with an aggressive elegance. This facade, however, was a performance, a mechanism to conceal a deep-seated insecurity and the fraying edges of her struggling business, Garrison Events LLC. She projected strength while privately crumbling, needing to maintain appearances and social standing at any cost. The second section of the infographic diagrams the mechanics of the actual fraud, revealing how a localized Ponzi scheme was meticulously executed under the guise of an event planning service. When her business faced severe financial stress due to overleverage and shifting market dynamics, Elaine saw her daughter Chloe's wedding not just as a portfolio piece, but as a potential financial lifeline. To bridge her cash flow gap, She persuaded her nephew, by then a meticulously organized logistics director, to use his pristine credit to open a specialized event financing account. He co-signed the credit line, believing it was a short-term, specialized facility that would directly pay vendors via escrow and be cleared within 90 days by Elaine's anticipated receivables. However, the scheme involved fabricating vendor invoices. The nephew would receive and approve payment requests that appeared legitimate, such as a catering invoice detailing a luxurious prime rib and local seafood menu for $22,000. In reality, the routing numbers on these inflated, fraudulent invoices were not for the vendors, but for Garrison Events LLC's operational account. Elaine intercepted the disbursements and diverted $75,000 from the nephew's credit facility to cover her own personal and business debts, including commercial rent and payroll, essentially using future deposits, the financing, to pay past liabilities. Consequently, for the actual wedding, Elaine hired vendors on deeply compromised budgets, downgrading the catering to basic chicken and bulk pasta for a contract barely worth $9,000. Crucially, to prevent the nephew from detecting the discrepancy between the luxurious event he thought he financed and the diminished reality, he was physically isolated at the reception. Despite arriving in a tailored suit, he was given a laminated vendor badge and told he was needed as a venue liaison. Elaine seated him behind velvet curtains in the massive catering staging area at a plastic folding table next to the dish scraping station, far from the grand doors and the ballroom, ensuring he would not mingle with other guests or talk to vendors who were still waiting for their final checks. The tension breaks in the third section, charting the confrontation and the inevitable legal consequences. This sequence begins with a critical audit and discovery. When the final vendor draws on the event financing line were rejected for insufficient funds, the nephew assumed it was a banking error and visited his commercial lending manager, Isabel. It was at her desk that the truth was revealed. Isabel analyzed the routing data and showed him that the $75,000 had not gone to the caterers, florists, or the venue, but directly to Garrison Events. Isabel explained that since the funds were transferred across state lines through a federally insured institution based on fraudulent invoices, this was not a family dispute but commercial wire fraud. Equipped with this definitive data, forged invoices versus real vendor contracts, the nephew initiated a structured shutdown. He authorized the bank to freeze Garrison Events profiles and then confronted Elaine at her commercial studio in downtown Newport. This was not a plea but a methodical dismantling. He arrived and simply laid the evidence out on her massive marble reception desk, the forged catering invoice next to the real contract and the routing number traced from the bank. His logistics background kicked in, overriding any emotion with a cold need for data and a firm plan. He presented her with clear options, offering to avoid federal charges if she signed over her studio's equity to a trust to repay the debts. When she chose a defensive posture, suing him and attempting to rally the family against him with maternal guilt and claims of ruthless destruction, the nephew executed the final stage of his plan. He attended a public industry panel about crisis management in event planning where Elaine was actively framing her recent bankruptcy as a family betrayal. Standing in the back, the nephew publicly audited her proprietary methods, exposing the Ponzi structure and presenting dossiers containing the bank records and forged invoices to journalists and prominent vendors, instantly evaporating her 20-year reputation. The legal repercussions were devastating. The fraud division investigation resulted in Elaine pleading guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud to avoid a public trial, and the judge, using the exact logistical timeline the nephew built, sentenced her to 41 months in a federal minimum security facility followed by 3 years of supervised release and court-ordered restitution. The infographic concludes by highlighting critical takeaways and lessons in autonomy, symbolizing the path forward and the reconstruction of an ethical framework. The first lesson is identifying psychological control. It requires recognizing that conditional family loyalty, when used to demand endless compliance as repayment for perceived debts, is inherently abusive. Freedom from coercive control means breaking the chains of obligation that were forged in vulnerability. Second, individuals must rigorously protect their financial independence, learning from this case that co-signing, even for trusted family members, should never be undertaken without full, independent transparency and a clear understanding of the transactional risks. The third takeaway celebrates the power of collective action. With Elaine permanently removed from the local market, the independent vendors she had defrauded formed a cooperative network. This new ethical infrastructure, consulting on standardized invoice routing and fair contracts, allowed small businesses to protect themselves and thrive, replacing exploitation with mutual support.
Finally, true resilience is defined.
It is not simply enduring trauma, it is the building of a self-determined life, free from old debts, on terms that are entirely one's own. The nephew, while maintaining his quiet logistics career, found a new community and consulted for this ethical network, ultimately sitting not isolated at a folding table, but at the center of a shared celebration, enjoying a seat among people who valued him for who he was, not as an asset to be managed or a contingency plan to exploit.